There are some watches where the pressure to just say they're icons, they're great, is massive. Watches that have been around for a long time and subsequently have gotten the title of icons. And then there are modern watches that are just massive sellers. If you're new into watches, it can be hard to separate the hype from the watch. How good is it, and for what reasons, and are there alternatives that are worth considering? That's this video, looking at the icons and the hits and giving a perspective on whether or not the watches live up to their reputations. Let's dive in. Before we get to the first watch, we need to set some ground rules. First of all, there's no truth to any of this. I've got an opinion, and my opinion is not better than anyone else's. If you like a watch, you like a watch. End of story. The goal of this video is not to pass judgment on any particular watch. The goal is to split apart the reasoning behind why this watch or that watch gets all that hype, and maybe offer an alternative. We might as well start with the big boy, the Rolex Submariner. Why is it so popular? It's popular for two reasons. It's a Rolex, it's been around for a long time, and it hasn't changed a ton. Whether you like it or not, Rolex is still popular. Rolex is still the dominant watch brand out there, accounting for an estimated 1/3 of all revenue generated on Swiss watches. The Submariner is the flagship sports model, and with that Rolex model, you have a watch and a brand that is recognizable. It conveys status and success. A big part of the Rolex allure is branding. That's not a criticism in any way. Mercedes is a brand that conjures up an image. Tesla, Apple, Garmin, Levi's. Brands convey something, and what Rolex conveys is appealing to people. If you're buying a Submariner because you want a piece of that self-perception, then this watch lives entirely up to the hype. But I would offer a counter-argument, and it starts with white gold and platinum. Don't worry, I'm not suggesting you buy a white gold watch, but the whole point of white gold is stealth wealth. Most people won't know that it's expensive or rare or exclusive, but you do. You. The owner of that white gold watch knows that this watch is made of an incredibly expensive and luxurious material, and you don't have the need to flash it. That inner confidence. Consider owning a watch that you know is good, is exclusive, is expensive, but doesn't have the Rolex logo. Could you do that? A Glashütte Original CQ costs more, is better finished. I personally think it looks better, but nobody would know outside of the nerd community. The point I'm making is when you buy something, you can know what you have on your wrist, if that's important to you. And to some extent, not caring is in some ways more of a power move. As for the second point, I said the watch has been around for a long time. I didn't say it was beautiful. It's not that it's an ugly watch. It's not at all. But it's an incredibly basic and simple design. The look of the Rolex Submariner is recognizable. It's also easy on the eye. It's easy to style. It's gotten a little bit more flashy over the years, but in some ways it's not a particularly distinctive watch. That's a good thing, because in some ways it's the perfect median dive watch. It's flashy, but it's not too flashy. It's bold, but it's not too bold. It's restrained, but it's not too restrained. As a first-time buyer, a new 6-digit Submariner reference says a lot, but it also says almost nothing. It's both a strength and a weakness. A lot of other watches convey a lot more character and personality. A Rolex Explorer 2 has personality simply because it's the less picked choice. Again, the CQ from Glashütte or even a Seamaster 300M have a lot more character. So is the Submariner overrated? For a first-time buyer, I would say it is. Very few people will regret buying a Rolex, and very few people will regret buying a sub. But considering its almost mid-grey positioning, I do think it's fair to argue that it's not as good a choice for a first-time watch buyer as the hype would have you believe. They took this watch to the moon, don't you know? You can be sure that Omega will never let you forget the story of how this watch went to the moon. Omega are in some ways like your grandfather telling the story about the time where he met Martin Luther King or Nelson Mandela or whoever. It's a cool story, but Grandpa, we've heard this story a million times now. Unlike the Rolex though, the moon story doesn't appeal to everybody. Despite Omega's efforts, a lot of people do not latch onto the story of space and exploration and rocket ships and history. It's a good story, but it's not as compelling as the Rolex logo in itself. The Omega logo isn't either. For watch nerds though, it's kind of a watch that at some point gets thrust upon you as one you should own because of its history, and just like the Submariner, because it's been around for a long time. As for the looks, this is generally accepted to be one of the most beautifully designed chronographs ever. It's legible, it's balanced, it's versatile, but still characteristic. Just the simple fact that it has curved lugs adds a level of character that a lot of Rolexes don't have. There's always this discussion of how big it is. Is it 42 millimeters like Omega says, or is it actually smaller? Just wear it and try it. It definitely wears smaller than you would think. And it's also objectively a watch that's a strap monster. You can wear more or less anything with this watch because there's no color to match the straps to, and it's a very matte watch. So there's no ceramic that, calls undue attention to it. Overall, the story of the Moon Swatch is a little bit overrated for the first-time watch buyer. The whole manual wind movement thing is interesting once you're a little bit down the road in your watch collecting journey. But as a watch, it's distinctive without being out there. It's incredible quality and still relatively good value for money. I don't think the watch itself is overrated. And if you like its looks, you're getting a watch with a lot of integrity. I'm pretty sure I said this in a video a while ago. Whenever a YouTuber has to do a list of great affordable starter watches, the Hamilton Khaki Field is going to be on the list. In that video, I also said I feel for all the times this watch gets mentioned, I do feel it's overrated. Now, this isn't a bad watch at all. There are a ton of different versions of it, from quartz to mechanical, from steel to titanium to DLC coated. So it's not just the base Hamilton Field watch. In the mechanical versions, the movement is a respectable but not conversation-worthy ETA movement. It's usually a brushed or sandblasted case. The dial is typically flat with legible numerals and a ton of lume. It's down to earth, it's unpretentious, it's practical. But it's got one problem. There are tons of watches just like it. Formex has an excellent option, which price-wise is in the ballpark. Veja, an American brand, have a $1,000 field watch that I personally think looks cooler with, the sub-second style, so a dirty dozen watch. It's more proportioned, it's got a nicer numeral layout and the sizing, and it's got a respectable Solita movement inside. Baltic has a slightly cheaper and more urban field kind of watch with a Miyota movement inside. Hamilton are brand-wise a household affordable watch brand name, and the Khakis are generally very nice watches, but they're not standout special. If you like, but there are comparable offerings out there for sure. If a watch is impossible to get at retail and still sells at 3 or 4 times over retail on the grey market, then it can't possibly be overrated, can it? Of course it can. The Nautilus is one of 3 core Gerald Genta icons: the Nautilus, the Royal Oak, and the Ingenieur. Discussing the aesthetic merits of those 3 Gentas is an exercise in futility to some extent. Some people feel the Royal Oak is best of the 3, others feel it's the Nautilus, and a small group might say it's the Ingenieur. Personally, I find the current day Nautilus to be a bit bland. That's entirely a personal opinion, but both the new Ingenieur and many variants of the Royal Oak I feel are superior. The Nautilus to me is not quite dressy, not quite sporty. It's just the Nautilus in its current iteration. There are a ton of variants and not all of them are executed equally well. The case and porthole design lends itself to some complications working well, where others just end up being a bit cramped and messy. Owning a 5711 or a 5811 communicates a lot about your financial situation, but this is a watch that I do feel is a victim of its own hype and shouldn't necessarily be your first choice. Not that a first-time watch buyer is likely going to get access to a 5811, but I would go Aquanaut. It's more of a statement if that's what you're looking for, because it's the road slightly less traveled. It's more stylable and wearable, and it's generally more versatile. Nico, he would disagree with me. He feels the only reason the Aquanaut is popular is because few people can actually get the Nautilus. I just disagree though. I feel it's good in its own right. So if you have the money, sure, the Nautilus says something, but the Aquanaut is the underrated alternative. Any IWC pilot. Whenever you bring up IWC Pilot's watches, you inevitably get a couple of comments. There are comments about prices in general, there are comments about movements not being particularly special, and there are comments about Leica and Stover and other Flieger brands making comparable offers that look incredibly similar for a fraction of the cost. So let's start with the movements. For the Pilot Mark 20, most of the Chronos, and the Big Pilot, all of these models have an in-house manufacture movement. Do some of these movements have origins tracing back to ETA movements? Sure. And so what? Besides, more and more of them don't anymore. They are fully in-house. At this price point, very few brands make as good-looking movements as IWC. IWC are masters at making well-finished movements behind massive glass case backs that expose the entire movement. The movement inside the IWC Pilot Chrono is not world-class, but it's a whole different beast than any Solita with a custom rotor that you find in the back of a Leica or Stover. The Mark 20, just as an example, doesn't have a display case back, but in general, the IWC movements are not just functional, they are aesthetically pleasing. Then there's the price. IWCs are more expensive by a huge margin. Are they worth it from a manufacturing cost perspective? No. I've said it a lot of times by now, but once you get above $4,000 or thereabouts, diminishing returns start to kick in. You're paying a lot more for a little more in terms of improved product. If your mind is set up to demand that 5 times the price equals 5 times the product, you're going to be disappointed because it doesn't work that way with most things, and definitely not with luxury goods like watches. So yeah, the IWC is probably too expensive for what it costs to put together. That leaves us with the looks. The question is IWC versus Leica or Stover. Is the IWC overrated in that comparison? I'm saying no. And hear me out why. The watches are not the same. If you want an authentic pilot's watch that conjures up the imagery of Spitfires and Messerschmitts and Sopwith Camels, then IWC is no longer the watch for you. The technology that goes into the movement is not just practical, it's also an aesthetic exercise. A Chrono Le Petit Prince has a sunray blue dial. It has multiple finishing techniques. It's got polishing and beveling and radial brushing and chamfering. There's a lot more going on, and despite it being a tool watch in its origins, that's no longer what it is. And that's why it's not overrated, because as a luxury Flieger, it's perfectly on point and on brand. However, if you want that humble authenticity of a functional timekeeping device, then the IWC is going to disappoint, because that's not what it is. That's the Leica or the Stover or the Draken or some other brand. Even a Breguet Type 20 is more authentic than an IWC. In many ways, a lot of the IWC Pilot's watches have gone through the same transformation that the Submariner from Rolex has also gone through, from being a tool to being a luxury jewelry timepiece. IWC is luxury first today, so it's not overrated. It's just not that kind of Flieger anymore. The PRX has been a crowd darling for a while. It's a sub $1,000 integrated sports watch in either quartz or mechanical with a hefty 70s design that has definitely helped Tissot sales numbers the past years. For the price, this was a very good watch upon release. At the time, it was a bit of a shock that you could get this level of finishing on a mechanical sub $1,000 watch. The Tissot looks good and at the time offered massive value for money. But like I said, at the time. It's been a couple of years now, and when it came out, this watch punched way above its price point in terms of build quality, features, and finishing. But today, a lot of other brands have caught up. Christopher Ward have the 12, which is double the price, but it's more than double better. The Yema Traveler competes for sure. Nevada also have a model that is again double the price, but it is a place where I argue that there's a marked and noticeable difference. There's also Citizen that released a small seconds version of the Tsuyosa, which is also incredibly well put together. The PRX isn't overrated, but it's not as stand out in quality as it was a couple of years back. Tudor released the monochrome Metas certified Black Bay diver this year, and together with the Black Bay Coke GMT, they stole the show at Watches and Wonders. The excitement for that watch was massive, considering it in quotation marks was just a black dial, black bezel diver. A lot of people call it the watch that the Submariner used to be. A little bit more true to its tool origins, a little less flashy, but with the 5-link Jubilee bracelet still capable of fitting into a dressier, more formal setting. My position on Metas is a fairly consistent one. I think Metas is overrated. The movement hasn't changed. You're just paying more for the privilege of having to go through a certification process. Tudor wouldn't do that if they didn't think that most of their movements would pass anyway. The practical real-world benefits are also negligible for most people. Remember, it's just as anti-magnetic as it was before. It's just as water-resistant. You're just paying more for a small improvement in accuracy, and if you rotate watches, it's basically going to make zero difference. The watch itself isn't necessarily overrated. It's a great watch, but for all of Tudor's marketing efforts, you're paying a bit extra for very little real-world benefit. It's a great watch, though, even though it's just a plain black diver. Tag Heuer Aqua Racer 300 date. Might as well get it over with. This watch is underrated. Why? Well, normally Tag Heuers are overpriced. Say Tag Heuer and my mind goes to a ridiculously expensive quartz watch somewhere in the collection, or that Kith watch that briefly caught our attention. But this watch, it's 42 millimeters, sounds big, but is it really? 13.1 millimeters in thickness, that's thinner than a Seamaster 300M. It has a 21 millimeter lug-to-lug. That's annoying, but so does the Tudor I just spoke about. It's lug-to-lug, 48 millimeters. With stubby lugs to the rescue, it's less than the Tudor. It's a Solita AMT movement, which is a high-end Solita that is COSC certified and has 80 hours of power reserve. That's also good. Price, $3,800. at least $600 cheaper than the Tudor. The dial's cool. It's maybe a little bit over the top on the wavy, but some people are going to like it. The bezel is ceramic, the case is attractively finished, and you even get an engraved case back. The octagonal bezel might be a little bit of an acquired taste, but then again, that's what gives it some personality. The bracelet has a not class-leading, but still a good quick adjust mechanism. Bashing on tag is sometimes a bit of a national pastime for watch nerds, but this is a solid offering. Grand Seiko are, in the grander scheme of things, a teeny tiny watch brand. It's hard to get clear numbers, but what I could find puts them at about 50 or 60,000 watches sold a year. That's not Rolex, Omega, or Tudor territory. They're one of Seiko's high-end offerings where the prices start in the ballpark of $6,000, $7,000 and go up from there into the hundreds of thousands for their specialty items. Their bread and butter are the heritage lines, so the white birches and the snowflakes and the shunbuns. The common theme of most Grand Seikos is typically a fully mechanical high beat or spring drive movement. It's an incredibly restrained design language, unlike anything you typically get from a lot of Western brands. It's Zaratsu polishing, and it's dials and wavy dials and textured dials and intricate dials. If you're talking to Grand Seiko fanboys, there's literally nothing better for the money. The movement, the finishing, the detail is in their eyes unsurpassed, and you're a cave dweller if you can't see it. On the other hand, there's Nico, who hates their marketing, thinks their watches are good but unremarkable, and at best shrugs in Grand Seiko's general direction. So, overrated or underrated? Zaratsu polishing is, in my opinion, overrated. Polishing has diminishing returns. At some point, you're in a category where you're dealing with something similar to tasting fine wine. Some sommelier is telling you about how you can taste the butterfly poop that makes up 0.3% of the terroir in the area and how that affects the notes of the wine. Most people either don't care or don't have the palate to notice that. There is a difference between regular and Zaratsu polishing, but I would argue that most people can't tell what it is unless they're explicitly told what to look for. Even then, they might just nod and say, oh, okay, I can see it. Their movements are good 5 Hz movements. In their mainstream models, like the white birch models, the finishing is good, but I prefer the look of an Omega 8900 or an IWC movement. It's again down to Grand Seiko's very restrained philosophy, where there's a bit more flourish typically to German and Swiss watch finishing. The dials are typically really impressive, and if you appreciate that kind of thing, you're going to love them. But the thing that's key to understanding Grand Seiko is subtlety and restraint. A Rolex Datejust is not subtle. An Omega Aquaterra is not really that subtle either. But Grand Seiko, they just made a dress watch, the SLG W003, and they made it out of titanium. Who the hell else uses titanium for a dress watch? It's literally a more subtle metal than highly polished 314 or 903L steel. There is sometimes a bit of snobbery towards Grand Seiko, like there is with lovers of classical music and opera. It sometimes comes across as, it's for the refined palate or the connoisseur. And in that regard, Grand Seiko is a little bit overrated, I think. Their watches are really good. You get a lot of watch for your money, but they're not that good. They're just designed from a philosophy of restraint and simplicity. But restraint and simplicity does not make it finer. It just makes it different. Opera isn't inherently more cultured or refined than rap music. It's just different. And if you like it, then cool. But for others, it just comes across as boring. If this was a rating of what was overpriced, pretty much anything from JLC would be on the list, including the Reverso. At a minimum of $8,000 for a base monoface, you are paying through the nose for the Reverso. But if you ask people about an iconic watch, then the Reverso is likely going to be on the list together with the Submariner, the Cartier Tank, and the Royal Oak. But here, the question isn't if it's overpriced, it's whether or not it's overrated. And no, there are square and rectangular watches out there, but I would argue that a lot of them are not great. Balancing a watch face which is inherently round onto a rectangular surface is hard. Figuring out how to shape the numerals and indices and just in general fitting everything in there is hard. In my view, the Cartier Tank is the second best rectangular watch. Controversial opinion, I know. The best is the Reverso, and it comes largely down to the absence of Cartier's usual signature Roman numerals in favor of sword hands and simple indices. JLC have had a long time to refine their dials, and it shows. There is one feature that I personally think is overrated, and that's the flipping mechanism. The whole flip it over to protect your watch while playing Povolo is about as practical as having a Submariner that can dive to 300 meters. Odds are I'll be diving to 300 meters before I sit on the back of an elephant knocking a ball around a field with a stick. The problem is only apparent though if you have a monoface without an engraving or don't have a duoface. I know monoface owners may be unhappy with my position on this, but for me, flipping the case over when there's nothing on the back has diminishing returns over time. When you have an engraving or a duoface, that mechanism just makes a whole lot more sense. Anyways, you'll be paying through the nose for JLC if you buy it firsthand, but if the look is for you, then the watch and the workmanship JLC put into it are definitely worth it. There are more icons and hot watches out there. This was my perspective on a couple of them. Don't get mad if you don't agree with me. It's just a perspective. There's no truth. All I aim is to share a perspective and invite civil conversation. Which leads me to you. Which iconic and popular watches are overrated to you and why? Share your thoughts in the comments. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe. Cheers.